bushman's bright lodges. I ride in this wind, on my good horse I call you, my shiny black bears, to the playhouse of fortune, to take the bright silver and gold you have taken from somebody else. And as we
You're listening to Unwelcome Guests on WEOS Geneva, 90.3 and 89.7 FM. I'm Lynn Gary. Today's broadcast will focus on the actual purpose of U.S. military activity and expenditure abroad, and its splendid success in the Caribbean and Central America. Its creation, a pool of slave labor that can undermine the wages of U.S. workers while reaping enormous profits for transnational corporations. In our first hour, we'll continue with our lecture series by Dr. Michael Parenti. His talk today, The Sword and the Dollar. In the second hour, we'll hear from teenage workers in El Salvador and Haiti about how little they earn and eat. Your average Finger Lakes cow lives better than they do. And we'll hear from one of the survivors of a massacre in a Guatemalan village, whose people were killed wholesale to make way for a World Bank-sponsored dam project built to provide electricity for maquiladoras in the city. What you hear in today's program will outrage and disgust you. But this is about more than feeling compassion for someone far away. Our fates are tied to theirs. 500,000 U.S. apparel jobs have been lost to these maquiladoras as a result of the North American Free Trade Agreement, NAFTA. And corporations are using their ability to export labor to force Americans to work harder for less. Last New Year's Eve, I was coming home on the thruway. It was 2 a.m., really cold and snowing hard. We pulled off at a gas station on the Weedsport exit. There was an old man in a beat-up car delivering newspapers in the cold and dark. The old man looked like a guy who worked hard all his life, and here he was, working for peanuts in the cold on New Year's Eve. Sadly, this guy probably thought he was doing honest work. It's not honest when people's lives are spent in labor that enriches others and leaves them poor. That is criminal. If you're old enough to remember the 60s, you may recall the glowing predictions of futurists that automation and technology would create a future filled with leisure and prosperity. This has come to pass, but only for a tiny minority. The rest of us are working harder for less. The fact is that less workers are needed due to technological advancements, and so prisons are being built at an accelerating rate to return that surplus humanity to profitability, as slave laborers working for a fraction of the minimum wage. And our hoodwinked people keep falling for the tough-on-crime rhetoric. The people imprisoned for murder, rape, and other violence represent a minority of prisoners. 2/3 of the people in prison are there on non-violent drug convictions, and many of the others are simply poor. Who knows how many thousands have committed no crime at all, but are there simply because they are poor, young, and black, and have been framed to beef up the arrest statistics of corrupt police forces. And the corporate bosses laugh all the way to the bank. This program is actually a class in learning to read between the lines of the lies our so-called leaders spout. By the end of this course, you will gain a different understanding about what is meant by defending democracy, tough on crime, war on drugs, economic empowerment zone, and free trade. Now, Dr. Michael Parenti.
Welcome to People's Video Audio, a series of talks by author and political analyst Michael Parenti. His books include Democracy for the Few, Land of Vitals, Political Mythology in America, and Against Empire. The topic of today's talk is The Sword and the Dollar, the history of imperialism and the forced maldevelopment of the Third World. It was given in Marin, California, February 1994. Here's Michael Parenti.
Central America, as you know, like most of the Third World, is suffering from acute poverty and economic stagnation, and this is called underdevelopment. And this underdevelopment is treated in academia and in the media and by government officials elsewhere as an original historical condition. It's something that was always there. It's due to the poverty of the land. The climate makes people lazy. I learned that when I was a kid. I remember teachers saying that people in the warmer climates just don't work as hard as we do. You know, mañana, and all that. Whereas we in the temperate climates, we work hard. It's due to overpopulation. They have too many children. And it's due to cultural backwardness. These are the reasons given. The reasons given to explain poverty in the third world are the same as the reasons given to explain poverty in the United States itself, except the climatic one. But all these others are lazy, too many kids, blah, blah, the other thing. In fact, the lands of Central America are very rich lands. The lands of the third world throughout Asia, Africa, Latin America. That's why the Europeans went through all the trouble to go there, to steal and plunder and settle them. In fact, these warm climates have produced ancient and magnificent civilizations back when the Europeans were still hunting pigs with sticks. They were great civilizations in places. In fact, they're more overpopulated today. They're more overpopulated today than they were in the earlier centuries before the Europeans came. So overpopulation is more a result of underdevelopment than a cause. In fact, that cultural backwardness, you know, that's a theme that's as old as Columbus. He was using it to justify enslaving people. I looked at the people in the 16th century and I said the Europeans had supremacy, really cultural supremacy, in just two areas. One was the whole area of navigational transportation, and the other was in the instruments of war and armaments and firepower. And it was that superior firepower, not superior civilization, that brought them to the positions of supremacy that they are in now. Through the centuries of colonization, there were other elaborate theories that were framed. One of the most interesting is the one that came along about the mid to late 19th century, that the colonized people are biologically backward, biologically undeveloped. They're savages. That the inferior level of cultural evolution, this assumes they have an inferior level, is commensurate with an inferior biological evolution. None other than Charles Darwin himself. You know, I learned in school that Herbert Spencer was the social Darwinist. Remember Herbert Spencer in the School of Social Darwinism, where they took Darwin's scientific findings and they applied them to the economy. Well, when I read Darwin, I found out that Darwin himself was a social Darwinist. He had all these kinds of theories about how naturally inferior these people were. Well, how were they really culturally inferior? Their architectural skills, horticulture, crafts, hunting, fishing technology, midwifery, medicines, herbs, and their tribal democratic practices were often much better and more advanced, much more an object of admiration than anything that could have been found in Europe at that time. I mean, we mustn't romanticize these original societies, some of which did have unjust and cruel practices, you know, of their own. But generally, you know, I looked at them and I say, you know where they lagged behind mostly? They lagged behind 16th, 17th, 18th, and 19th century Europe. This is the list I could come up with. Hangings, murders, syphilis, gonorrhea, smallpox, typhoid, bubonic plague, poverty, both urban and rural, slavery, prostitution, religious wars, and inquisitional witch hunts. Those areas, I would say, Europe took first place in those centuries. The poverty of Central America and the Third World, masses of people crowded into urban slums, living in utter destitution in rural villages at times, illiteracy, unemployment, hunger, disease, comes because the land is given over to commercial cash export crops and absentee ownership. It comes because they're growing coffee, sugar, beef for export instead of beans and rice for indigenous consumption, home consumption, domestic consumption. The labor and the resources of Central America are devoted to one thing primarily, capital accumulation. especially emphasis on the labor. I gave the example once of El Salvador, where I was looking at who's in El Salvador. You know who's in El Salvador of the Fortune 500? Everybody. Cargill, General Motors, all these corporations are down there in Central America. Harvester, Chase Manhattan, in El Salvador. And I said, what's in El Salvador? Some sugar, some cotton, what are they all doing there? And they're down there for that other ingredient in the productive process, the one that really creates surplus value, which is human labor. And the Salvadoran workers are producing everything from energy rods to baby powder to cooking powder, baking powder, rubber tires, computers, automobile parts. All this is being done for other consumption markets. It's called outsourcing, where the companies go down and bring the stuff and use the cheap labor. And all those transportation costs to do that make it worth it. It's still more profitable to do that and to have those things put together in El Salvador than in Ohio, because in Ohio you pay people $10 an hour, and down there you pay them 60 cents an hour. So the labor and resources are devoted to one thing primarily: capital accumulation. Self-sustenance and self-employment gives way to wage labor. And that pattern is very striking in the Third World, throughout the Third World. From 1970 to 1980, the number of wage workers in the Third World grew from 72 million to 120 million, and the rate is accelerating. That same pattern exists in the United States. Back in the middle of the last century, early part of the 1800s, 75% of this population, the U.S. population, was self-employed. Today, it's about 8%. I mean, it's been a gradual decline. 40, 20, 15, you go right down, it's down to about 8 now. And many self-employed people are really self-employed on the sufferance of some other larger supplier. The essence of capital investment is not to uplift a country or develop it, nor to bring civilization. Those are the patronizing ethnocentric rationales that are given. I mean, we do hear that the developed countries in the North must help the underdeveloped countries. What does underdeveloped mean? It means retarded in some way. You just didn't go through a certain process. They're not as capable of evolving. They need aid. They need Peace Corps volunteers to show them how to do things. They need missionaries and movies and McDonald's and Donald Duck and Mickey Mouse, especially Mickey Mouse. And cognizant that underdeveloped carries some negative connotations, the Third World nations and the UN and the Wall Street Journal and most communist parties in the world, publications left, right, and center, all now use another term, which I do not ever use in my writings, a slightly less insulting but hilariously inaccurate term. They're called developing nations. So they're just late bloomers. I use third world because I find developing to be a very deceptive term, a euphemistic way of saying underdeveloped. It presumes that poverty was an original condition. It presumes that these countries are developing when in fact in many of them the conditions are getting worse. The people in these countries don't need to be taught how to farm. They need the land to farm and the implements. They don't need to be taught how to fish. They know how to fish. They need the boats and the nets and access to shore frontage and bays and oceans. They need someone to stop the chemical plants from dumping their toxic effusions into the waters and rivers. They don't need to be convinced that they should use hygienic standards. They don't need a Peace Corps volunteer to tell them that, to tell them to boil their water, especially when they can't find any wood to light a fire with. They need the conditions that will allow them to have clean drinking water and clean clothes and homes. They don't need nutritional advice on balanced diets from North Americans. They need food, and they usually know better than the North Americans what foods serve their nutritional needs, usually. Underdevelopment, what's called underdevelopment, is a condition which is forcefully imposed on these countries through history. One of the most dramatic examples is India. In 1810, India was exporting more textiles, finished mass-market textiles, not just those beautiful, exquisite silks that we always associate with India. Mass-market textiles, where it was exporting more textiles to England than England was exporting to India, and more to China, and more to Egypt, more to a number of other places. In 1810, by 1830, the British had put up prohibitive barriers and blocked out Indian goods and had moved in and were dumping their goods in India. And within a matter of another 10 years, the great textile centers of Dhaka and Madras were turned into ghost towns. And the people were sent back out on the land to do what? To raise the cotton, the raw materials that would be used in the factories of Manchester and Lancashire and London. So that India was reduced to being a cow, like much of the Third World, to be milked and not to be developed. And by 1850, India's debt had grown to 53 million pounds. And from 1850 to 1900, the per capita income in India dropped by two-thirds, almost two-thirds, 65%. I mean, that's an incredible drop. So we always associate India with poverty, the masses of poverty. That's not their original condition. They're not an underdeveloped country. England underdeveloped India. Ireland is another example. Ireland is a country that's not usually associated with the Third World. Well, it's the first colony, England's very first. It was the first imperialism. It goes back to, what, 13th century, 14th century, whatever. Engels was in Ireland, spent some time there. Frederick Engels, Karl Marx's collaborator, for the benefit of some who might not recognize the name. In 1856, he wrote, quote, "How often have the Irish started out to achieve something, and every time they have been crushed politically and industrially. By consistent oppression, they have been artificially converted into an utterly impoverished nation." Very interesting wordage. Artificially converted. And so the same with Central America. Artificially converted. The Mayan Indians in Guatemala had a better diet. They had more calories, more protein, and better conditions of health in the early 16th century before the Europeans came than they do have today. They had more artists, more musicians, more architects, more horticulturalists than they do today. They are not underdeveloped. They've been overexploited. They've been maldeveloped. The legacy of U.S. economic dominance is not only hunger and strife and misery, but an economic structure that bears very little functional relationship to the needs of Central America, of the people of Central America. The most important characteristic of the region's economy is that it's dominated by a network of international corporations which themselves are beholden to parent companies that have their place in North America, Europe, and Japan, roughly in that order, especially North America. If there's any harmonization, by the way, of these interests, it's with the global investor classes, between them. They're harmonizing their interests. That's what's getting integrated, not the indigenous economies of these countries. NAFTA, the North American Free Trade Agreement, is an attempt to rationalize this. It gives the total green light. It wipes away whatever political controls that democratic forces have been able to institute. NAFTA will not integrate the economies. You hear that talk all the time. These economies are going to be integrated. I heard John Chancellor, that fatuous commentator, wisdom peddler, saying, well, there was a time when we had small villages and we had to move to a regional economy. Then a regional economy wasn't enough. We had to move to a national economy. And now we're all going to have to move to a global economy. Just, that's all. Simple as that. That's all it is. A benign, ordinary development. It's not an integration into a global economy because these capital investments, untrammeled as they are, actually fragment the productive forces in these countries. Any productive forces that operate for the needs of the people. Just look in our own country. Just look at what free trade and mobility of capital has done to the industrial Midwest of the U.S. We now even have a term for it. We call it the Rust Belt. That's a remarkable admission, isn't it? Well, but it's something that just happened, you see. The Central American economies, like those in most places in the Third World, remain fragmented and unintegrated, both between each other, between the various countries, and within themselves, both in the flow of capital and goods and in technology and organization. A global economy, a world economy that has little to do with the needs of the people of the world. That's a rather remarkable thought when you think about it. Huh? The other legacy of economic domination is political suppression and unspeakable atrocities. The counterinsurgency funded and led by the United States in El Salvador against a broadly based liberation movement led to the deaths of what? By now maybe 70,000 Salvadorans killed. Many thousands more believed to have been murdered by right-wing death squads. 540,000 have fled into exile. Another 250,000 have been displaced or forced into resettlement camps. This is all one little country, El Salvador, a country of only 4 million people. So just about everybody has been directly or indirectly affected, has either suffered death or suffered a terrible loss of loved ones or close ones. The Salvadoran army massacred whole villages suspected of being sympathetic to the guerrillas. An eyewitness victim interview taken by then Congresswoman Barbara Mikulski of a Salvadoran peasant woman. Quote, "Many members of my family were killed. I saw children around the age of 8 being raped, and then the soldiers would take their bayonets and make mincemeat out of them. With their guns they would shoot at their faces. The army cut people up and put soap and coffee in their stomachs as a mocking. They would slit the stomach of a pregnant woman and take the child out as if they were taking eggs out of an iguana. That is what I saw." And El Salvador today, in the U.S. media and by our U.S. political leaders, is called a democracy. Manuel de Conceição, a peasant leader in Brazil, was arrested by the Brazilian security police when the junta ran Brazil. Police who had been schooled at U.S. Army bases in the latest methods of counterinsurgency and interrogation for his crime of protesting the economic conditions of his life and of his people. This is how Manuel was treated. For 4 months I was heavily tortured by the army in Rio de Janeiro and then in the Naval Information Center. Near death I was taken to the hospital for the 6th time. The beatings had been so severe that my body was one big bruise. The blood clotted under my skin and all the hair on my body fell out. They pulled out all my fingernails. They poked needles through my sexual organs and used a rope to drag me across the floor by my testicles. Right afterwards they hung me upside down by my ankles. They hung me handcuffed from a grating and tied my penis so I could not urinate. They forced me to stand for 3 days without food or drink. They gave me so many drugs that my eardrums burst and I am impotent. They nailed my penis to a table for 24 hours. They tied me up like a pig and threw me into a pool so that I nearly drowned. They put me in a completely dark cell where I remained for 30 days, urinating and defecating in the same place where I had to sleep. They fed me only bread soaked in water. They put me in a rubber box and turned on a siren. For 3 days I neither ate nor slept, and I nearly went mad. This was done by the defenders of the Western world, by defenders of the free way, you see, the free market, with the aid and the training of the CIA and other such groups. Victims of these military and police defenders of democracy were financed by the U.S., tortured people with electric shock. They forced victims, and this is in El Salvador and in Guatemala, Honduras, not in Panama, not in Nicaragua, not in Cuba. These are the things. They forced victims to witness the torture of friends and relatives, including children. They raped women in the presence of other family members. They burned sexual organs with acid or scalding water. They placed rats in women's vaginas and into the mouths of other prisoners. They mutilated, punctured, and cut off various parts of the body, including genitalia, eyes, and tongue. They injected air into women's breasts and into veins, causing slow, painful death. They shoved bayonets and clubs into the vagina, or in the case of men, into the anus, causing rupture and death. And I have other descriptions that make that one look almost mild, but I'm going to skip them. I think you get the idea. Yet I would argue that imperialism is rational. It harnesses these cruel and horrible and twisted impulses. It enlists them. It instigates them. It instigates them. These guys weren't born torturers. I mean, they didn't go around and say, who's been ripping out the arms of rabbits and chickens? You can come work for us. They took ordinary guys and said, we are going to train you as professionals. And torturers have testified that we are professionals. We use certain methods to elicit information, and we have to do this, and it's a tough job and all that. And the guys who finance them, who sit in Langley, Virginia, say, heck, I mean, it's a jungle out there. I'm not that happy about the kind of methods we sometimes have to use, but when you're facing these tough kind of people, you got to use the same methods they do, and so forth, so on. In other words, you always justify your crimes by saying that your victim was the criminal. That's a rational process of training torturers for what is a rational set of interests. They didn't go down there for torturing, just for the sake of torturing. They used torture in order to be down there and stay down there and defend their privileges and their interests. I want to make that point because sometimes imperial domination is explained as arising from the will to dominate, an innate desire for territorial expansion, a territorial imperative. But in fact, territorial imperialism is not the dominant mode. It hasn't been in generations. Today, there's very relatively little colonial dominion. I mean, the U.S. controls Puerto Rico, Guam, a few other places. What you have today is neo-imperialism, where the country has its nominal independence, its own president and its own currency and its own police and all that, and all you do is you control its exports and imports, its land, as we did with Cuba, with sugar, tobacco, its tourist trade, and all those other things. You allow them the trappings of sovereignty while you control the wealth. I heard someone at the World Affairs Council, I went there to hear a friend speak, and someone got up from the audience. There's a lot of academics and professionals and all that, World Affairs Council types, and he said, well, ironically, Cuba has come full cycle since the days before the Revolution. Before the Revolution, the tourist trade was only for the Yankees. The hotels and beaches were only for the foreigners, and the Cubans needed Yankee dollars to use them. And today it's the same thing. Ironically, Cuba is back to its pre-revolutionary position. There are beaches for foreigners, the dollar beaches, if you can dollars, because Cuba is so strapped for hard currency. There are hotels where foreigners stay. The Cubans couldn't afford it. They don't have the dollars and all that. So it's the same. And I got up and I said, no, it's not the same, because the surplus value or the profits of the pre-revolutionary trade went to big corporations, gamblers, mobsters, whorehouse owners, and the like, generals on the take and such. And today, the surplus value that is received by the Cubans goes to the government. What the Cubans have done is they said, we have so few hard currency resources. One of them is our sun and our beautiful beaches and all that. Let's try to start a tourist trade and make that a source of hard currency. And that's what we've been doing. But that money goes back to the people and pays for their health clinics and their education and these other things. So Cuba is not in the same place. If Cuba were in exactly the same place it was before the revolution, this government would be hugging and kissing the Cubans. They'd be giving support like they do to Shevardnadze or Yeltsin or Havel or one of those people. We wouldn't still have the blockade and the embargo and squeezing them as it is. Until that surplus value, until every penny of it goes back to the few and is taken out of the hands of the many, there will be antagonism toward Cuba. The U.S. policy toward Central America for almost 2 centuries has consisted of the 3 I's: interference, invasion, and investment. It's not the outgrowth of any kind of democratic national dialogue or consensus between the American people and their leaders. It's not the response to democratic pressure. It's not the result of mass jingoism, a longing for invasion or power, expansion or war, or popular hysteria. The history books tell us that about the Spanish-American War, that it was a popular hysteria. I've done my study of it. Most people in 1898 weren't interested in going to war. They were trying to get jobs. The labor movement in the U.S. had very little interest in overseas expansion, and in fact was, for the most part, opposed. Not all. The same with the Gulf War, a very jingo war. In July 90, most Americans, opinion polls showed, most Americans favored negotiated settlements, which is what the Iraqis also favored. It was only after several months of media war hysteria and White House war hysteria and hyping it up and pumping it up and the actual commitment of troops and the promise of a quick, easy win that the U.S. public got on its yellow ribbon binge. And even at the time, some of you may remember, I said they're going to develop a postpartum depression. They're going to come down from this yellow ribbon high, and the American people have the habit of then drifting off into reality, and they have to forcefully be shoved back to face the harsh illusions of the ruling elites. And indeed, that happened. The conqueror, George Bush, the guy who had a 93% approval rating by the end of it, couldn't even beat Bill Clinton in the election. So that kind of jingoism, when it is hyped up, is ephemeral and short-lived. In other words, these policies of invasion, interference, and investment do not come because we want them. I make this point because it's an important thing. I remember being at the City University of New York on a panel. Michael Harrington was on it and he was speaking, and somebody from the audience said, "Michael, why is U.S. foreign policy so stupid?" To Michael Harrington. And Michael Harrington said, "Well, we are the good Germans. We have this power thing. We are the busybodies, and we try to go here and there when we shouldn't." And he went on, and I responded. I said, I have to disagree with that. Maybe the confusion is in using this word we. We don't make this policy. They do. And the policy isn't stupid. It's remarkably successful and brutal for their interests. It's stupid to us because it doesn't do anything for us. It costs us money. It doesn't give us anything but wars and tribulations and all. But it's very useful for they. So maybe we should stop saying we do this and we go there. It's a very rational policy to support governments that are open to U.S. corporate interests and to oppose or overthrow governments, be they communist or populist or whatever, that have some measure of independent development and some measure of redistribution of surplus value. Even a country like Iraq, even a country like Libya, where there's some redistribution of surplus value, that is the country that will be targeted. That is the criteria in every instance for the most part. And too many analysts, the late Michael Harrington used this word we. Howard Zinn uses we, I notice. I've got to tell Howard about this sometime. Noam Chomsky uses we in his weaker, quicker moments. Ramsey Clark gets up and gives these brilliant, powerful, moving talks about Iraq and what he's done, and he keeps saying we. And we've done this to them, and we've done that to them. I want to say, Ramsey. I'm sitting there saying, oh, it wasn't we, no. We should stop saying we. And this is more than semantics. It's really a very important point because it is defining political reality. Because those who keep saying we might often fall into the mistake of treating the nation as the basic unit of analysis in international affairs. Sometimes it is, but often it isn't. Even sometimes in simple nation-state territorial rivalries, the issues are defined by political economic elites who are less likely to serve the interests of the general populace and more likely to define their own interests as the general interest. And every time you say we, they love it. You're playing right into their hands. These policies don't just happen. There is conscious will pursuing a conscious goal and conscious intent and conscious interest. Is it true, brothers and sisters, that unlike the rest of us, the rich and powerful don't act with conscious intent? Not only economic policy doesn't happen, the economy itself just doesn't happen. I mean, the economy. What is the economy? Do you ever think? I mean, strictly speaking, there's no such thing as the economy. Nobody has ever seen an economy. You cannot touch or see or feel an economy. What you can see are people engaged in exchange of values, in productive labor and in not such productive labor. And we take all these different actualities and activities and we take them together and we form what is called a hypothetical construct. And we abstract from that and we call that the economy. It's a hypothetical construct. abstracted from observable actualities. Now, our abstractions are very powerful things. Like other abstractions, this one becomes a reified entry. You see, first you abstract from the reality, and then you endow it with a mechanical reality or motive of its own. Sort of a conceptual Jurassic Park or something like that. So now we talk about the economy as a self-generating force. The problems of the economy, not the problems of capitalism, not the problems of what the corporations are doing to us, but the problems of the economy. The economy becomes an entity of its own. So we hear statements like, the economy is in a slump. The economy is in the doldrums. You get the image of this big, bulky, moody economy. The economy is making a comeback like a sports hero, the one that always catches my attention. The economy is acting funny.
You are listening to author and political analyst Michael Parenti on The Sword and the Dollar. At the end of the program, there will be information on how to obtain a copy of this talk.
We do the same thing with the whole concept of nation. It's reified and abstracted. What the nation does, what the United States does this, and the United States does that, and we do this, and we get ourselves into that. So we are reifying even when we say we. We should start asking when we hear one of our leaders or our media pundits say, our interests necessitate this action, or we're looking out for U.S. interests, what are U.S. interests? By the way, that question first started to intrigue me back in 1967. I was writing my first book, and I was a postdoctoral fellow at Yale University, and I sat in the Sterling Memorial Library, and I went through about 30 volumes of the Department of State bulletins. I mean, huge volumes of these bulletins. You know what I was looking for? I was looking for what U.S. interests were. It was the height of the Vietnam War, and all I kept hearing about was our interests, U.S. interests. So I said, I gotta find out what these interests are. And I went through these volumes day after day. I remember the librarian said, what are you looking for? I notice you don't take any notes. You keep getting volume 10, 11, 12, 14, 107, and I'm going through looking for. Finally, I came across one instance of U.S. interest. It's very interesting. When it was mentioned that U.S. presence would be taken as a U.S. interest. You see, so we said, it is in our interest to maintain a presence in that area. What I found was William Bundy, State Department official, said, it is in our interest to maintain our military bases in the Philippines. I said, I came off my seat. Here it is, U.S. interest, I'm going to find out, finally, is to maintain these bases. Now that's very interesting, because normally you would have thought the bases were there to maintain U.S. interests. But now we hear that U.S. interest is to maintain the bases. The instrumental value becomes its own end value, a common thing in human thought and all that. And then Bundy, he went on, he said, but there's a more important U.S. interest in the Philippines. This is the only example I could find in all these volumes. And again, I went even further to the edge of my seat. Now my palms were getting kind of sweaty from the excitement. And I quote what he said. He was speaking to an audience in Manila, to a U.S. and Filipino elite audience in Manila, and he said, the Philippines mean so much to the United States because the Filipino people have so often demonstrated that across barriers of oceans and cultures, this is a country, the Philippines, where Americans are always, as Filipinos so often say, made to feel, quote, at home. It's a touching statement. I mean, at home is a peculiarly Filipino phrase, I guess. In other words, if I understood Bundy, our most important interest in the Philippines was the preservation of Filipino hospitality. By the way, there wasn't a dry eye in the audience, I imagine. Well, one could say, look, Parenti, this complaint about the mass of the people not making policy is a truism. It's true of all public policy. It's not formulated by the masses, your beloved masses whom you idealize. Average people have a low level of information by any objective measurement. They have no input in the policy process. Government policy, both domestic and foreign, almost always has its origin in elite circles, political, economic elites, think tanks, the higher circles of government and corporate worlds, the Council of Foreign Relations, the Trilateral Commission, the bankers, the CEOs, the investors, the top managers, their publicists, the policy specialists, the journalists, all these kinds of high-powered personages. They're the ones who become the secretaries of state, defense, treasury, commerce. They become the heads of the CIA and the National Security Council. They monopolize policy. They create policy. The most we can hope for from the public, the argument continues, is that at election time it gives its stamp of approval or disapproval to one or another policy elite. So the argument goes. By the way, this model of elite democracy was enunciated by many, Joseph Schumpeter, by Walter Lippmann, and the like. Most recently by conservative political scientists like Diane Ziegler, and by the great political theorist Spiro Agnew. And I knew I was going to get a laugh by that, just saying that name. In response, I would say, not true. It's not true that all policy originates with policy elites. An ounce of data is worth a pound of polemic, I would say. I would say just the opposite, that almost all policy that is worthwhile, all policy that is worthwhile, all of it that is life-affirming, all of it that is democratic in its substantive output, all of that policy has come from the common, ordinary people. The struggle for women's rights for 100 years, what presidents, what cabinet members, what high-power policy specialists, what one in that 100 years, name one that came out for women's rights and talked about it. There was one, the wife of one, Eleanor Roosevelt. She was the wife of a president. That's the closest women got to it. The struggle for civil rights, what one? Name the great policy leaders, the great political, economic, financial leaders, elites, what one of them, 12 years in the White House, FDR, never once came out for FEPC, Fair Employment Practice Commission. Never once came out against Jim Crow. Harry S. Truman finally did, but he reluctantly, in very marginal ways. JFK was downright opposed to Martin Luther King's mobilization march on Washington, and he wished that the whole civil rights agitation could have gone away because it led to uncomfortable schisms in the base of his support. Name the political economic elites of the 19th century who fought for and not against the 10-hour day. Name the elites who fought for the 8-hour day, who originated, who got the idea, who generated, who built the base, who brought forth all the pamphlets and the calls and the organizations and everything else, who faced up to the police. Name the political economic elites who fought for the right to collective bargaining. Name them. Franklin Roosevelt finally came out with a collective bargaining bill, the National Labor Relations Act. That was a sop he was tossing out. He had no idea that the people in America were going to grab it and go on into industrial unionization. Millions of people were going to move suddenly because collective bargaining and the right to have unions was now legal. They could face their town sheriffs and state militia and police feeling they had the federal government behind them. But that was only after years and years of agitation. They're at the other end of the policy process when it comes to democratic policy, reluctantly responding to it. Name the great policy, political leaders and captains of industry. Name them who struggled for public education, who struggled to end child labor, who struggled for clean and safe drinking water so there couldn't be no more typhoid epidemics in Philadelphia and Baltimore and places like that, who struggled for safe housing codes, who struggled for public parks. There were individuals, some of them from privileged backgrounds, by the way, who fought for those things, but usually not when they were in government. If they were in government, they couldn't have fought for them. If these were the things that the rich and the powerful had wanted, they wouldn't have to be. You wouldn't say the struggle for this, the struggle for that. They would have just had them. You wouldn't have had to struggle for them. And so today, name who are the big political leaders right in the last 20 years. Name them. Who originated the environmental movement. Only when that movement got a mass base did you find a vice president wrote a book about it. Name them. This came from the public, from the concerns of lay persons, from lay organizations, like this one, self-supporting, that have to have bake sales and speeches and whatever else to grab money together to have some visibility and organization to push for this thing, devoted to pressuring the Environmental Protection Agency to do what it should be doing anyway. An Environmental Protection Agency that was created only in response to those pressures, to try to sort of give them the impression that government was looking after this thing after a while. The consumer protection market. Who started that? I'll tell you who started it. Consumers started it. Getting unsafe products and medications off the market. That's not what a capitalist government does, taking goods off the market. The function of a capitalist government is to get things on the market. It's too busy doing that, getting things on the market with subsidies and export supports, even for lethal tobacco products, and investment tax breaks, free research and development for the corporate producers. That's what government's busy doing. They're generating that kind of policy. They're too busy to protect the consumer. The consumer has to protect herself and himself. The ban on tobacco and liquor advertising. Who originated that idea? Tell me the fearless political leader who went up against the tobacco lobby and said, I got a new original idea. We're going to ban you. No. It was down here. It was down here and here, and it has to percolate up and finally push them to do something. Maybe you have more power than you realize. The anti-nuclear movement. Don't tell me that was government. The government was up to its ears in hiding the crimes, the toxic waste, the fallout, the murder of GIs and downwinders in Utah and atomic energy workers in the plants, hiding how they were dying like flies from exposure. They were too busy hiding it to be fighting the unsafe features of the nuclear movement. The Freedom of Information Act. Who were the political leaders? Name one who came out for that. That was a public demand. Government's job is not to free information. Government's job is to restrict, to seal files, to put them under security, not open to the public, inking out, manipulating and changing history, keeping us from knowing what they did. So, reaffirming to you again and again that what they do is legitimate and honest and wise and true, but not letting you know what they did or why they did it, and giving you the document with 2/3 of it inked out. Their job is to undermine the Freedom of Information Act. Our job is to fight for it. If government were really interested in protecting the public interest rather than the private power structure and the private profiteers. Now, I don't want to overstate it. Policy elites have played a creative role in some areas. But it's very important to be balanced. They say to me, Parenti, you should be balanced. We've had 98% of the other side, and your 2% is just too truthful, and it's tipping the scales too much. So let's give them credit. Let's try to be balanced. The thing, policy elites have played a creative role. The Manhattan Project to build an atomic bomb. The nuclear industry, then handed over to private business at a fraction of its cost and subsidized repeatedly billions of dollars every year. Creating the FBI, CIA, the national security state apparatus, the global military apparatus, 300 major bases around the world. And by the way, they talk about closing bases. How about starting to close overseas bases? All the focus is on the domestic bases. They closed one in the Philippines, and that's because it took a volcano to kind of turn it, to trash it. And then the Filipino Senate said close it. Then they finally closed one. McCarthyism, ideological witch hunts, loyalty and security programs. These were all started by our creative policy elites. Foreign aid programs to military dictators and torturers. Those electric shock instruments that they use to put on the genitals of peasant leaders, those were made and brought down there by the CIA. That's a lot of technology and hardware. Getting into wars, creating crises that justify military intervention. The secret surveillance of our personal lives. Intervention in Guatemala, El Salvador, Nicaragua, the invasion of Panama, Grenada, Iraq, the move into Somalia. Remember the mass movement of people demonstrating in the streets, please let's send troops to Somalia? Don't you remember that? I guess we were all away that weekend. Right? So they can show they're creative in death squads, torture squads, bombings and missiles, policies that control, destroy, dominate, and manipulate. I'm giving you a picture here now. Whose interests do they serve? If certain kinds of life-affirming policies have to be struggled with and fought for, and you have to take every little bit right out of their teeth and their greedy little paws. Whereas these other policies, they're doing all the time. You have to struggle then to find out even that the policy happens. What is it they're doing? They're too busy practicing militarism and fascism in order to bolster capitalism, all the while claiming to be saving democracy from communism, or now to save democracy from demon dictators, warlords, terrorists, and the like. Joseph Schumpeter wrote, the conservative economist, that capitalism means peace, that imperialism exists because it's a residue of the old swashbuckling feudal times, the Colonel Blimp thing. That in fact, here's his quote, industrial and commercial activity is essentially unheroic in the Knight's sense. And the ideology that glorifies the idea of fighting for fighting's sake understandably withers in the office among all the columns of figures. Capitalism is too busy just getting that bottom line together and producing and doing that stuff to go off on these silly imperialisms. Now, is he serious? He was writing this in the early part of this century when British imperialism was at its height and U.S. imperialism was taking off. Don't underestimate the ability of class apologists to fabricate images out of whole cloth. He was writing at a time when the soldier clerks in the East India Company with their accounting books in one hand and their Gatling guns in another were killing Indians. When the various European capitalist states were engaged in bloody wars with each other about carving up the third world in Africa, Asia, Latin America, whatever else. But by the way, as ridiculous as he sounds, he's no different from what we hear today. Other conservative theorists write off empire just as a general impulse to dominate, but doesn't explain why they want to dominate some people rather than other people. We hear a lot that it was George Bush's macho impulses that led him to go invade Panama. By the way, I have no doubt that he was considering his macho image and the polls and all that and how that would work. But it doesn't explain why he hit Panama. Why doesn't he go and invade Mexico or Canada or whatever? It doesn't explain why certain kinds of countries are hit. I'm sure Clinton's bombing of Iraq was his presidential blooding and macho flexing of muscles. He can't stand up to the Senate Judiciary Committee, so he turns around and goes out and kills some more Iraqis, so that he's tough. I mean, why is this macho impulse going in always on the side of the landowners? This need to dominate. Why does it always go in on the side of the corporate investors rather than on the side of the peasants, the workers, the students, and the clergy who want social change? I mean, Robin Hood was macho. He was macho. You can be macho in many different ways, for many different causes. Macho for peace, macho for equality, macho for treating women with respect and humanity. What's left out of such impulse theory is the whole matrix of class and corporate interest. Such theories divorce politics from economics and attach them to a kind of homespun, ahistorical psychopolitics or psychologism. Schumpeter is much better when he talks about ancient imperialisms, ones that didn't involve his own particular class. Listen to what he says about ancient Rome. Rome pursued that policy which pretends to aspire to peace, but unerringly generates war. The policy of continual preparation for war, the policy of meddlesome interventionism. There was no corner of the known world where some interest was not alleged to be in danger or under actual attack. If the interests were not Roman, they were those of Rome's allies. And if Rome had no allies, then allies would be invented. When it was utterly impossible to contrive such an interest, why then it was the national honor that had been insulted. The fight was always invested with an aura of legality. Rome was always being attacked by evil-minded neighbors, always fighting for a breathing space. The whole world was pervaded by a host of enemies, and it was manifestly Rome's duty to guard against their indubitably aggressive designs. They were enemies who only waited to fall upon the Roman people. Now, does that sound familiar at all to anybody? Now, these are the rationales for expansion, but they're not the motives. They're not the actual real interests. But we hear that today, that there's a world out there of adversaries who are just waiting to fall upon the American people. They don't, for some reason, fall upon Denmark. They don't fall upon Spain or Brazil, but they fall upon us. But Schumpeter, I said he was very good about ancient imperialism. He says the real motives in Rome were not all these manufactured incidents. Motives could only be understood by looking at, quote, what domestic class interests benefited from the empire. Those who gained were the aristocracy of landlords, agricultural entrepreneurs, born of struggle against their own people, whose dominance rested on control of the state machine. He had it right on target. Schumpeter, the conservative, had a Marxist analysis of ancient Rome. Because it was 2,000 years away, he felt comfortable enough to say the truth. Now that's not a Marxist analysis, that just happens to be reality. Marx didn't invent that, he just discovered that, or was one of the people to state it. The historian Ernst Babian adds to the idea about ancient Rome. He said, no administration in history has ever devoted itself so wholeheartedly to fleecing its subjects for the private benefit of its ruling class as did Rome. He was writing before the Bush, Reagan, Clinton era. Well, let me end right here and say that what we should do, what is to be done, and I'm not going to answer any more what can we do questions, I'm going to answer them right now, is we must above all emphasize the costs of empire to our own people. To point out that we have a community of interest, not with that we talk about up there, not with the they, but we have a community interest with the common people of these other countries. The incredible tax burden that we bear, the military burden, the subsequent starvation of human services and things, the price this has affected on us in terms of crime and poverty and underemployment, the environmental costs. This huge military establishment is the single biggest polluter in America. It's the U.S. Air Force, Army, Navy. The distorting effects on the economy and technology, the exportation of jobs, the threat to democracy that comes from a national security state, the surveillance, the secrecy, the irresponsible state power, the suppression of dialogue, the wars and the killings that some of our young people come back as victims in plastic bags too. So we must emphasize that these policies are not supporting our interests. It's not just a matter of be noble, be sacrificing, be caring for the poor little people there. You tell people this, and if they have a suspicion that their own interests are involved and their government is supporting their interests, then they'll choose their interests over and against any noble sentiments about other people. But if you point out how, in fact, this government is in no way supporting their interests, then they sometimes begin to listen. And so we must educate, agitate, organize, demonstrate, support alternative media, alternative organizations, pressure our officials, try what we can to break the ideological monopoly. There is an immense ideological monopoly on foreign affairs. You can get debate about some issues, toxic waste dumps, health care, this, that. It is almost impossible to get any debate on foreign policy other than tactical, strategic stuff, the kind of thing you hear in those Sunday afternoon TV panel discussions. You cannot get people raising the questions of the kind of raised today. People of this persuasion do not get on the mass media. We must above all deny the community of interest with the rulers. See who our enemies really are. Our enemies are those who profess to be our leaders. Our enemies are amidst us in our living rooms every evening on the TV set. Challenge the ideological totalitarian monopoly of government and media. It ain't easy because they do control most of it. The monopoly that does not allow this kind of critique to come before the American people. Push for things like Panama Deception, an Academy Award-winning movie documentary that was suppressed completely in the mass media, shown only on KQED, PBS, or a few evenings, and only then because there's a reform movement at KQED, you see. They didn't do it regardless of, but because of that challenge. And above all, don't worry about your legitimacy and credibility. The way to win credibility is to speak the truth as forcefully and clearly as possible. It's one thing to tone down the rhetoric, it's another thing to dilute the content. Never dilute the content, never blunt your sword. As forcefully, as clearly as possible, speak the truth, as I hope I've done today. Thank you.